probably aware of some of the things that will be discussed on this particular video, but I think it's a very good job explaining how money is transferred from ordinary, caring, working people to the elite in any country, including ours. So I think you'll find this a valuable discussion and very, very useful to confirm what you already know and maybe to pick up some other ideas that are worthwhile.
Okay, so let's get into it. First, we need to gain a basic understanding of how the financial world works. It's actually much simpler than you think. Let's start with the history of this guy, cash. From the beginning of human history, money has taken on lots of forms. Alcohol, sheeps, sticks, tobaccos, seashells, etc. But for all of recent history, the only currency that has continued to hold its value over the long term has been gold and silver. If you've seen The Count of Monte Cristo, you will recall that when he shows up to buy a palace, he hands over a carriage full of gold, and the transaction is complete. But gold and silver are heavy and inconvenient. So in the 1500s in Europe, they got a bit clever about this. People started storing their gold at the goldsmiths, effectively a vault. The goldsmith would give you a receipt for the gold you deposited there, and now, instead of hauling around a hoard of gold, which is inconvenient and easy to rob, the Count of Monte Cristo can buy his palace with a briefcase full of receipts. Voila, paper money or cash becomes popular. It all started as a receipt for real money, the gold and silver. It was very popular indeed, but the goldsmiths started to notice something. There was always gold in the vault. Some people came in and deposited gold. Some people came in to withdraw. And the amount of gold in the vault fluctuated each day, but it never went to zero, because never did everyone come in and take their gold out all at once. So one gold banker had an idea. He knew that when he lent someone money, he could charge them interest. He knew that no one except for him knew how much gold was really in his vault. So what if he just created a receipt for gold and lent it to someone? If the person came to redeem the receipt for gold, it was no problem. He could give them the gold. He always had some on hand, and eventually that person would pay him back with interest. When he was paid back, he simply tore up the receipt for the principal of the loan, but he kept the receipt for the interest. Basically, he got free gold. Well, the goldsmith got really good at this. He did it again and again and with more and more money. So imagine you are the only gold banker in the village, and there's, say, 1,000 ounces of gold receipts floating around the village economy. And now you've figured out that you can lend 9,000 ounces of gold receipts out to people and charge interest. How long do you think it would take before you had the 1,000 ounces of real gold receipts from all the interest you're generating? Not long at all. Very quickly, the goldsmiths became some of the wealthiest people in the cities of Europe. While everyone else worked hard, they just printed unbacked gold receipts and charged the citizens interest on it. This scam was later called fractional reserve banking. And it's called that because there's only a fraction of the gold on reserve that there are receipts for the gold in existence. All right, stay with me here. Not 1 in 100 people understand what you're about to learn. And that's why 1% of Americans control 99% of the wealth. See, living large with a river of free money flowing into their pockets, the gold bankers quickly figured something else out. When they lent out lots of fraudulent money, the economy boomed. As loads of extra money circulated in the economy, businesses found it easy to make a profit, so they hired more people, and wages went up. The workers spent those wages on even more goods and services, and so more businesses boomed, and prices of the real estate, goods and services all soared. These fractional reserve bankers found they could cause inflation. When the goldsmiths reduced how much they lent out, the reverse happened. Money became less abundant, so businesses struggled and started to go out of business. Workers weren't needed and lost their jobs. The people started spending even less, causing more businesses to go under and create even more unemployment until eventually all those people who had borrowed money from the goldsmiths could not repay their loans. Worse, in the attempt to make good their debts, they had to sell their homes, their businesses, and their most precious assets. The problem was, it was happening to everyone at the same time, and there were no buyers. So the price of those things plummeted. The fractional reserve bankers realized they could create deflation too. And who do you think was there to buy everything up, for just pennies on the dollar after they crashed the economy. The goldsmiths. Now, are you starting to see how the shell game is played? It gets worse. You see, they figured out they could cause a boom by creating fake money and lending it to people and earning interest. Then, when the people started repaying the loans, if they didn't relend all of the money back out, they could cause a recession. The less money they lent out, the bigger the recession. The bigger the recession, the cheaper they could force the people indebted to them to sell their assets. It's pretty easy to see why the goldsmiths became the mega wealthy people of Europe. And like most business ecosystems, a few goldsmiths rose to the top and became tycoons. The type that could buy anything with their immense wealth. They could buy politicians and have them outlaw other goldsmiths. They could buy up to smaller goldsmiths. Very soon, the gold banker tycoons had consolidated enough wealth and power to compete with the kings and queens, and they became the financial powerhouse of Europe and therefore the world. One of them was a goldsmith out of Germany, Mayer Rothschild, and he had a plan. He thought, what if I partner with the kings of Europe to eliminate all competition? What if I can convince the kings that there should be one central bank for their country? He knew that he could convince them that with his system, they would be able to borrow unlimited amounts of money to fund any projects they wanted, whether it was exploration of the globe, or pay for wars, or create social programs. So he dispatched his 5 sons to London, Paris, Naples, Vienna, and Frankfurt to carry out his plan. And they were very successful. They set up partnerships with the kings of those countries. They created the Bank of England and the Bank of France that are still in operation today. They legitimized the money printing scam with the term fractional reserve banking and presided over the boom and bust cycles of Europe. You thought the gold bankers made a lot of money with the fake money scam before? Well, now the governments of the world were borrowing money from them. The wealth flowing into the bankers' pockets was beyond your imagination. And with that wealth came incredible power. In fact, Nathan Rothschild, eldest son of Mayer, the founder and principal owner of the Bank of England, said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Wikipedia offers this. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was the founder of the Rothschild Family International Banking Dynasty that became the most successful family business in history. In 2005, he was ranked 7th on the Forbes magazine list of the 20 most influential businessmen of all time. The business magazine referred to him as the founding father of international finance. Interestingly, number 1 on the Forbes list was Henry Ford, who said this on the topic: "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning."
Okay, so we are back. The history of money is easier to understand when it's not convoluted by the talking heads you see on TV, right? When it's presented so simply, it makes you wonder if the politicians, news reporters, and academics deliberately try to refuse you so that you lose interest. To me, it is an amazing and fascinating story of how a small group of people became the power elite of the planet. And for the most part, the majority of us do not even know this part of history, or the names of the most powerful people of the 18th and 19th century. The wealth that was stolen from the masses by the banking cartels through special privileges granted by governments is mind-blowing. We thankfully live in enlightened times, right? We would never tolerate such an unfair and unjust system today. Think again. Now it's time to discover the truth about the Federal Reserve, how it came to be, and how it works. Now, do me a favour and go ahead and let me know what you thought of Module 1 in the box below. If you thought it was great, say yes. If you have any other feedback, let me know. I'd love to hear it. So here's Module number 2. It goes for about 10 minutes. I'll see you on the other side.
So now you know the fairly insidious origins of paper money, fractional reserve banking, the boom-bust cycle, and inflation and deflation. But what about the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States? Well, there was a problem there. You see, the Founding Fathers had seen the Rothschilds and the other international bankers virtually enslave the nations of Europe through debt in just a few hundred years, and they were very wary of it. In fact, they had just fought a war against England, who was forced to raise taxes from the American colonies to help make their interest payments to the international bankers. Thomas Jefferson wrote on the subject, The central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I am an enemy to all banks discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. That means printing notes not backed by gold or silver or fractional reserve banking. He goes on, if the American people allow private banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the boom-bust cycle, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Most people have no idea what the Federal Reserve even does. It's crucial that you understand if you want to survive what's coming. And that is, on the 23rd of December, when most of Congress had gone home for Christmas in the near-empty halls of Capitol Hill, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law shortly thereafter. If you're like me, what you find out next may start to make you pretty angry. It outlined the powers given to the Federal Reserve Bank, and after a few amendments to the Federal Reserve Act, 194 over the next 99 years to be exact, the rules are as follows. They are 1. The Federal Reserve System shall have the monopoly on creating money in the U.S. 2. The Reserve Bank shall be a private corporation. That's right. The Reserve Bank is not an arm of the government. It's a private bank. It's no more federal than Federal Express. 3. The shareholders, the articles of incorporation, and the management of the Fed shall never be open to public scrutiny. It shall remain cloaked in mystery and kept away from the prying eyes of the American people and Congress. 4. And finally, it allowed the Federal Reserve to print as much money as Congress requested and charge interest to the U.S. taxpayer. Now, I need for you to understand how ridiculous central banks are. If governments are going to just recklessly print money, then the government could just print as much money as it ever needed. They would never owe 1 penny of interest on it, ever. Instead, they allowed a group of mega wealthy people to have the sole right to print as much U.S. dollars as they like out of thin air and lend it to the government or the people at interest, enslaving them with debt. But the bankers were not happy with that. They said, well, if we lend the government money, how do we know we'll get paid back? You see, there was no income tax then. The U.S. government could not just raise taxes at will like we've grown used to now. So in that same year, 1913, the Income Tax Act passed, opening the door for the federal government to tax its citizens directly and be able to steal their wealth and give it to the international bankers in interest payments. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh, Sr. Lamenting his participation, former President Wilson wrote in his memoirs, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of free opinion. No longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of small groups of dominant men." So there you have it, the Federal Reserve, how it works, and who it's working for. It's not there for you. It's there to take from you through interest repayments, inflation, and the boom-bust cycle it creates. Believe it or not, what you just learned is the key to the massive wealth transfer that has already begun. Think about it. We find ourselves in a world today where almost every country on the planet has a central bank operating on the principles of it being privately owned and collecting interest on money they printed out of nothing. And the result is this. Virtually all of the major economies around the world are in debt. Just look at this. The U.S., the U.K., Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, Ireland, Japan, on and on. I know you're smart enough to know that all these countries don't owe the few countries that are not on the list. It's not like all the wealthy countries owe Tunisia, Egypt, and Costa Rica. No, all those countries are in debt as well. So who do we owe? You see, what will never be mentioned in any official publication, what you will never learn in school, is that the vast majority of this money is owed to a very, very small and exclusive group of ultra-wealthy international bankers. This secretive group of people has been granted a monopoly on printing the world's money out of thin air and charging us interest on it. This banking practice involves all the major governments of the world. As a result, there's a river of money flowing out of our pockets through taxes and inflation and into the bankers' pockets. That's so wide you can't even imagine it. The numbers are beyond comprehension. Ed sums it up perfectly at one of his famous speeches recorded in 1994.
Where is this money going? You get the mental picture that maybe it's going into a big lake someplace. There's a big dam and it's building up. All this money is accumulating and these people are getting richer and richer and richer. Wrong. Doesn't work that way. When a person has all the wealth that he can possibly want or use for the pleasures of life, what is left? Power. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, they're spending this money, this river of wealth is being used to acquire power over you and me and our children. They are literally buying up the world with it. And I don't mean they're buying up the real estate and the hardware. They're buying up control over the organizations, the institutions through which people live and act and rely on for leadership and opinion. Technically, in sociological terms, this is called a power center. These are the power centers of society, the groups through which people work. And this is where that money has been going, is to acquire control over these groups and institutions by buying up influence and control over the people who run them. And they're spending the money on that. That means that they're buying up politicians, political parties, television networks, cable networks, newspapers, magazines, publishing houses, wire services, motion picture studios, universities, labor unions, church organizations, trade associations, tax-exempt foundations, multinational corporations, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it. Any group, any institution which exercises influence has been a target for control. And they have a lot of money to spend to acquire that control.
That's why you won't hear this on the mainstream media, you didn't learn about it in school, and you will be demonized or ignored if you are a political candidate who advocates the abolition of the Federal Reserve like Ron Paul and many others. The reason for going into all that history was to wake you up and expose you to the truth. Without that understanding of history, everything else you are about to learn won't make sense to you. I understand how you may feel, and it's so easy to say, well, the politicians will figure it out eventually, or the markets are too sophisticated these days, we can't have a Great Depression again. For the current generation of people in the Western world, it's too hard to imagine because we never lived through it. But a great, great depression is coming. The signs are everywhere, and if you're not prepared, you will be wiped out. It's that simple. There are three main reasons that I have time to cover during this presentation as to why this depression will be much, much worse than the Great Depression of the 30s. First is debt. At the time of the Great Depression, America was the world's largest creditor, meaning more money was owed to the U.S. than any other country in the world. Today, the U.S. is the largest debtor, meaning it owes more money than any other nation on earth. In fact, as of 2012, the U.S. national debt was $16 trillion. The estimated population of the United States is 313 million. So each citizen's share of the debt is $51,000. If you take out the elderly, children, and the unemployed, each taxpayer's share of the debt is nearly $137,000. But the average wage earner in the U.S. earns just $40,000. However, just in case you thought that debt could be paid off, you should know it's actually going to soar. And here's why. After World War II from 1946, people around the world bred like rabbits. They created the baby boomer generation. It was a huge spike in births that lasted 18 years before falling off dramatically. Well, the first of the baby boomers will begin to retire 65 years from 1946. That's 2011. Starting in 2012, and every year after that, for the next 18 years, a huge portion of the workforce will retire. And that means their government-funded health costs and pension costs will inevitably soar. You see, when the baby boomers were in the workforce in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were 45 workers for every retiree to pay for their pension cost. But as the baby boomers move out of the workforce and into retirement, That figure will change to just 3 workers for every retiree promised a pension. If you aren't furious yet, you will be. Today's workforce in their 20s, 30s, and 40s have no chance whatsoever to pay off the debt or pay for the retirement of the baby boomers, let alone do both at the same time. And this isn't even argued by anyone. In fact, if you recall, in August of 2011, there was a debt ceiling crisis, and President Obama had the leaders of the Republican and Democrats locked away for weeks trying to negotiate a deal. They wanted to raise the debt ceiling so we could go even further into debt. The Republicans were insisting on huge spending cuts. Well, in politician speak, spending cuts doesn't mean spending less next year compared to this year. That is literally impossible with the baby boomers requiring pensions and the huge interest on our debt. It just means spending a little bit less than the planned increase in spending.
This is how much our debt was going to rise before the compromise deal, nearly $29 trillion in 10 years. This is how it looks afterwards. The black shows how much of the overspending will be cut down to $26 trillion.
That's right. The very best outlook for U.S. debt is for it to double in 10 years. If America were a family making $58,000 per year, they'd have $327,000 in credit card debt, and they would be planning big budget cuts that would bring their spending down from $75,000 to $72,000 per year. A truly ridiculous state of affairs. I cannot stress this enough. The U.S. economy will be crushed under the weight of its debt and pension liabilities, and no one is suggesting otherwise. That is why, for the first time in history, America has lost its AAA credit rating.
News, the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's has decided to downgrade America's credit rating, America's AAA credit rating. They've downgraded it, fallout from the debt crisis. Alan Chernoff is in New York.
The deal struck this week to avoid default, to raise the debt ceiling and cut spending simply isn't sufficient. It's not enough to stabilize the debt situation of the United States.
By now, you're probably thinking, it can't get any worse than this. Well, unfortunately, it gets much worse. Or for me, because of the way I'm situated, it gets much better. You see, the baby boomers retiring causes another problem. In most countries around the world, governments created forced retirement plans. They forced people to put money in investments for their retirement. In America, it's known as a 401k. For decades, baby boomers were forced to save their money into their 401k. Of that money, the vast majority was invested into the stock market. Because the stock market had been steadily climbing for decades, everyone's retirement nest egg has risen over the last 30 to 40 years. It all looked wonderful as the money poured into the stock market by law. The downside to all of this is that it has created the biggest asset bubble in history. As the baby boomers retire, that same 401k law will force them to sell off a portion of their stocks year by year to live off those funds. So, for the young workers of the world, in addition to paying off a debt they have no chance of paying off, and in addition to paying for the retirement of the baby boomers they have no chance of paying, they will also need to pour money they don't have into the stock market at a rate equal to or greater than the rate many baby boomers are pulling it out just to stop it collapsing. It simply cannot happen. Already nearly 30% of the stock market value from the 2008 high has been eroded as the early boomers start to pull their money out. In the Great Depression, the stock market fell 89% in 3 years. I hope you see by now that the strength of the forces behind the coming collapse is far greater than during the Great Depression. And by the time this crash is finished, a lot more than 89% will be gone. In order to attempt to meet its obligations, the U.S. government will have to increase taxes and cut tax credits your family relies on. Medicare, unemployment benefits, pensions, education, and military expenses will all have to be cut. I've just scratched the surface of this topic, but I think by now you can start to see the point I'm trying to make. A total economic collapse, the likes which the world has never seen before, has already begun. It's an unstoppable tsunami, and it's headed right for us all. So you may be thinking, geez, Jared, how about the good news? Well, it's time for part 3, learning how incredible fortunes are made on the other side of this collapse. Remember, wealth is not destroyed, it's only transferred. The bigger the collapse, the bigger the wealth transfers will be. Almost everything will be taken from the unprepared and delivered to those few that have prepared and positioned themselves to take advantage and emerge victorious. And I have to warn you, it will be tempting to hesitate and try to pretend you didn't hear all this right now. But the key to positioning yourself on the receiving end of all this wealth is to take action right now. The last time we saw a taste of what was to come was in the 1970s. Those who were positioned correctly could have racked up a 2,200% gain when gold ran up from $35 an ounce to over $800 an ounce. Imagine that. Every $10,000 invested turned into $220,000. You may remember the gold rush of the 70s. Well, that's nothing compared to what we're looking at today. Think 10 times that return or more. Before this is over, if you take the steps we'll show you, it's entirely possible that a $100 investment in gold and silver could rocket up to the equivalent of $100,000. I'll explain how that could happen in a minute. First, to know how to profit from the collapse, we need to look at how the collapse will unfold. There are two ways it could happen. One is a deflationary collapse like the Great Depression. Simply put, loans are defaulted on, banks collapse, savings are eroded, and the price of stock, real estate, and virtually all assets plummet with few exceptions. The reason this type of collapse happened during the Great Depression was because when the international bankers created the Federal Reserve, they didn't get everything they wanted up front, and they didn't have the right to just print money unrestrained. The people would never have allowed it back then. Originally, currency creation was backed by gold. The Fed could only print as much money as the Treasury had gold in the vault. But in 1933, Roosevelt abandoned the gold standard. We moved to a pseudo-gold standard with a partial gold backing, and in 1971, Nixon cut all ties of the dollar to gold, creating a truly fiat currency out of the U.S. dollar. Fiat just means the currency is backed by nothing. And with that act, the floodgates opened to an ever-increasing money supply as the Fed printed more and more money at faster and faster rates. As this graph shows, each step in the move towards a total fiat currency has resulted in larger and larger inflation. And that blue line is if you measure the inflation the same way you would have for the 200 years beforehand. So the government will have two options to deal with being unable to meet its obligations. First, it can simply default on its loan payments and declare bankruptcy. If that happened, funding for the pension checks, unemployment benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security would dry up. The government would no longer be able to send out wages to the military, post office workers, bureaucrats, and all other federal employees. It wouldn't even be able to send out food stamps to the 46 million people who depend on them to eat every day. That's a pretty scary thought for a politician, considering in America today more than 50% of people receive a government check for one thing or another. Or the second choice is to do what all governments with a fiat currency at their disposal have done when they are faced with this dilemma. They can simply turn on the printing presses, manufacture trillions more in dollars, and make all of their repayments with this new money. The problem is the law of supply and demand means that the greater the supply of something, the less it's worth. Remember that. It's a law just as real as gravity. Former head of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, has already told us this is exactly what they intend to do.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. What I think the S&P thing did was to hit a nerve that there's something basically bad going on.
You see, no one wants to be the president or the head of the Fed or a congressperson to stand up and say, the United States is bankrupt. The United States cannot pay its interest repayments, its military, its police, and its retirees. We can no longer afford to help the unemployed or provide food stamps. In order to pay our debts, the standard of living in this country is going to have to decline. That would take political courage few dare have. Besides, why would you do that when you can simply print more money? You see, that is the option that every president of the United States has chosen since our purely fiat currency came into existence in 1980. In fact, as you can see in this graph, the yellow bars indicate the U.S. debt. The orange line indicates the trend that the government simply raises the debt ceiling. That's politicians' code for printing more money. Every time the government runs out of the money, instead of cutting back on entitlements and promises as it should. Now, this is 30 years of history right here. Democrats, Republicans, it makes no difference at all. So whatever you do, don't just tell yourself everything will be okay after the 2012 election if my preferred candidate gets voted in. It will make no meaningful difference at all who wins the next election, and the cost of that naivety will be devastating. The great wealth transfer will happen. So, how much money are they printing? Well, as you can see here, by 2008, it took the Fed 100 years to create a little less than $900 billion. But in only the next 3 years, they tripled the number of U.S. dollars circulating to over 2.7 trillion, guaranteeing massive inflation for the United States and robbing you and me of the purchasing power of our savings. Even more offensive than that, they gave this money to themselves as bailouts for the big international banks, not the little banks that are their competition, just the big banks, the ones that are owned by the same people who control the Fed. You know, the ones they tell us that are too big to fail. What will this mean to you? Well, on this graph, you see the history of the purchasing power of the United States dollar since 1792. The dotted line indicates when U.S. dollars were not redeemable in gold or silver. When you hear your grandparents talk about a gallon of milk costing 15 cents, but now it's $3, it's because of this. When the politicians print money to pay for their election promises, instead of doing the unpopular thing, like raising taxes to pay for them, they create inflation, which means the purchasing powers of the dollars you have are stolen from you as your money buys less and less and prices go up and up. It's really a hidden tax increase. Listen, the value of a gallon of milk has not changed in 1,000 years. As you can see here, when the currency is backed by gold, prices don't rise. Purchasing power is not lost. It is the value of the dollars we purchase the goods with that has been declining as they simply print too much of it.
Well, I think it's pretty easy to see that the American dollar is tanking. At some point in the near future, I don't know what date that will be, but at some point, probably within the next few years, the dollar will be practically worthless. It will buy much, much less, if anything, but certainly much less than it's purchasing today.
So if when the Fed prints this amount of money, it causes the value of the dollar to fall this much at this level of inflation, what do you think this level of money printing will do? How could it possibly end any differently than it has before? And as the levels of debt and federal obligation continue to rise exponentially, and they continue to increase the money supply exponentially, what will that do to your savings account or the value of your wages? It means this: unless you prepare to shelter your wealth outside of fiat currencies like the U.S. dollar and euro, your costs are going to skyrocket, and you'll be poorer no matter how much paper money you have. You could have $1 million in the bank today, and if you don't protect it from the hyperinflation tsunami that's coming, you could be a homeless millionaire before this is all over. When your rent is suddenly $1 million a month, you can easily be out on the street in weeks, even if you are wealthy today. That said, later I'll show you how you could go from living paycheck to paycheck now to living debt-free on an estate with all the toys you can dream up. Where you end up all depends on what you do in the next few months. Now, I'm not joking or exaggerating. I wish I were. This has all happened before. The feds can't suspend gravity, and they can't stop this economic train wreck either. The inescapable conclusion that any reasonable person comes to is the amount of money the Fed has already printed will lead to hyperinflation. We need go no further than the history books to know exactly what happens when you recklessly print money. In the last 100 years alone, we have seen hyperinflation in Japan, Argentina, Brazil, Russia, Germany, and most recently Zimbabwe and dozens more. Every time hyperinflation was caused by printing too much fiat currency. And here is the list of countries that overprinted a fiat currency and didn't go into hyperinflation. 0. There are none. It's a 100% failure rate. So now, if you look clearly at the evidence I've shown you, you will see why I believe we are headed for an economic collapse. It is the inevitable result of our debt, our pension obligations, our aging population, and the imminent stock market collapse as retirement plans start pulling money out of the market. We know the exact anatomy of how that collapse will take place. Alan Greenspan told us. Therefore, we should expect the U.S. dollar to become next to worthless, just scraps of paper, and the basic necessities of life like food and water will be unaffordable for everyone trying to buy them with cash as the Fed prints the currency into oblivion. So what happened in all of these hyperinflationary collapses of the past, and why does this happen? It happens the second the masses realize their paper money is worthless and they panic. Here's paper money being swept away in the street in Hungary in 1946. Here are children playing with bricks of money in Germany in 1923. Here is a woman burning paper money for heat because the paper is worth more as paper than it is to buy fuel. And the most recent of all hyperinflationary collapses, Zimbabwe. You see, what these pictures fail to really capture is the devastation and suffering that people are subject to as a result of not protecting their wealth in time. In a moment, we will show you just how easy that is and the amazing fortunes you can create in these tough times. But let's just pause for a moment and think about how it must feel to walk to the grocery store with your life savings and not be able to even afford food for you and your family. Imagine having worked hard for years to be able to buy a home only to find out that all the equity you built up has disappeared. That very fate happened to millions after 2008, and it will happen to hundreds of millions more worldwide over the next few years. Imagine looking at your retirement nest egg or your child's education fund and realizing that all you sacrificed and worked for all those years is worth nothing. Sure, you may have $50,000 saved up, but suddenly with hyperinflation, college could cost $500,000 or even $5 million. You might not be able to pay for a night school with $50,000. I know this sounds crazy, but that's why I'm taking the time to show you how many times this has happened before and why it's so much worse now. Think about your friends and everyone you know going through the same feeling at the same time. Then think, what about the people receiving a pension? Maybe you're one of them. Maybe your parents are. Imagine getting your monthly pension check for $1,000 and only being able to buy a loaf of bread with it. What if you lost your job during all of this? And if you don't think it can happen to you, just ask Enron, Lehman Brothers, or an MF Global employee. During a collapse, everyone is at risk. By the way, I want you to know that although I believe I will make an absolute fortune over the next few years, I would happily trade that windfall so others do not have to go through the pain and suffering that is on the horizon. That is why I'm doing this webinar. I want to educate as many people as possible between now and then so the middle class can be saved instead of wiped out. And as Tony Robbins says, the first and best way you can help the poor is to not be one of them. Once you achieve that, then you are capable of saving others. Let's get into exactly how you can be on the right side of the great wealth transfer. I'm going to show you how you can build a fortune quickly and help those around you when they need you the most. As you'll see, out of this darkness comes a once-in-a-lifetime chance for you to be free to live the life of your dreams. To find out how, let's take a look at what people do after a currency collapse. People still need to buy food, and they still need to buy water and groceries. And so they barter with their hard assets, which have become so much more valuable than any paper money. But there is one thing that they go back to using as money after every single hyperinflationary economic collapse. The same thing they've used as money for more than 6,000 years.
If you need cooking oil, you have to exchange with gold. If you need meal, you have to exchange it with gold. If you need soap, you have to change with gold. Everything is gold, no Zimbabwean dollars.
The gold traders are demanding 4 times the going rate from people who are too hungry and too desperate to refuse them.
kubva kuchii chese chinodiwa ragoridhe hakuna chichakwanisa kutenga kuti bate zimidhora rapedza kudhara hatizivi kurishanda nokuti kana ukaribata ukasvika naro mushopu inonzi harishanda haisi mari.
Yes, they go back to using gold and silver. You see, gold and silver have been used as currency since the dawn of civilization because it has intrinsic value. Remember, the gold bankers tricked the world into not using gold and silver so they could print worthless bits of paper in endless quantities. And every time, eventually, the people recognize this paper for what it is, worthless. As Robert Kiyosaki, author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, says, cash is trash. It's shocking to say the least, but it's true. You see, every time throughout history, without exception, Whenever the masses are silly enough to accept the fiat currency, that currency is abused until hyperinflation sets in. Inevitably, the free market rejects the current currency and gold and silver return as the true money. When the paper currency devalues to match the value of gold, those who hold gold and silver make absolute fortunes, and those who own nothing but paper money are devastated. It's just that simple, and it's happened over and over again. The reason it keeps happening is the truth is kept from the people. Schools don't teach this economic history for a reason. If you can see what's coming because you know history is repeating itself, then you have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to profit from the upcoming wealth transfer, but only if you are prepared in advance. Once the panic starts, it's too late. If you don't take these steps I'm about to share with you now, the future is going to be brutal, frightening, and painful. You will lose everything and be robbed of your dignity. It's happened before, and it's coming again. There's a reason why the Depression-era generation didn't waste anything, didn't go into debt, and were very, very careful with their money. We've forgotten their lessons, and the bill is coming due for a whole lot of mistakes far, far bigger than anything imagined in the Great Depression. That's why I'm sharing all of this with you. You're among the lucky few who will have a chance to escape the collapse and come out far, far better on the other side. So let's take a look at what history teaches us about the value of these precious metals during a hyperinflationary collapse. In Germany in 1918, to finance World War I, the German government increased the money supply by 400%. Some very wise people at the time knew what must happen when the printing presses are turned on and began buying as much gold as they could, trading their Deutschmarks for precious metals. Well, inevitably, inflation began. Slowly at first, just 10% per year, then 20% per year. More and more people started to wake up, and people traded their marks for gold as they noticed that their savings and wealth were being eroded by inflation. Groceries, gasoline, and all of the basics of life were becoming harder and harder to purchase, very similar to what we see around the world today. As each month passed, the amount of gold, or anything for that matter, you could get for your marks decreased. The longer you waited, the less you could get with your savings, and your cash became worth less and less. So at one end of the spectrum, you have the people who could see the train coming, took action, and preserved whatever wealth they had. And at the other end, you had the naive who refused to believe that their government could mismanage their currency so completely that it would become worthless and that their country could experience hyperinflation. After just a few years of high inflation, by 1922, the people had rejected the mark completely and turned to gold and silver for money, and hyperinflation began. In just 12 months, inflation hit 325 million%. Again, I have to warn you about the dangers of procrastination. When the collapse hits, it will be just like a balloon popping. Everything will change instantly. Historically, the ones who have waited till the end were completely wiped out. Their savings became utterly worthless. And as they had to sell their last assets and barter for basic necessities like food, the economy crumbled around them. Stock markets and the real estate markets plummeted to just pennies on the dollar. And who do you think were around to buy up all of the bargains? That's right, the ones who had the vision and foresight to preserve their wealth in gold and silver just months or years earlier. That is why it is said that during a collapse, he who loses least wins, because you can buy what has been lost for pennies. In fact, in 1923 in downtown Munich or Berlin, you could buy an entire city block for just 25 ounces of gold, around $45,000 in today's money. Think about it. Let me ask you, if you could walk into New York, London, Sydney, Paris, or Beijing and buy a whole city block for just $45,000, how much would you buy? Or if you only had a few $1,000s, would a dozen homes do? Do you think you could live off the rent from that and never have to work again? If you've ever played the board game Monopoly, you know that owning property with a bunch of houses and hotels on it can make you a fortune. When the economy crashes and the dollar collapses, if you're positioned with gold and silver, you can scoop up houses and hotels while everyone else discovers their currency is Monopoly money. In fact, you may know Paris Hilton is the heiress to the Hilton fortune. Did you know in 1933, Conrad Hilton bought his first hotel for $30,000 in the Great Depression? That hotel was generating $30,000 per year. During the Depression, it was easy to buy property that paid itself off after 1 year. Just 4 years later, he owned 5 hotels debt-free. And from there, he built one of the largest hotel chains in the world. scooping up valuable, tangible assets like real estate, businesses, rare art, jewelry, cars, boats, even airplanes for pennies on the dollar is a favorite strategy of Success Council members. Want to pay for your kids' college? Now it can take $100,000 or more. But after the great wealth transfer, a few ounces of your gold could pay for the whole 4-year ride. This is how some of the world's richest people got wealthy in the first place. Back in the Great Depression after the 1929 stock market crash, J. Paul Getty bought a controlling interest in 200 businesses, including Tidewater Associated Oil Company. When he died in 1976, he was worth $2 billion. In today's dollars, he'd be one of the richest men in the world, hands down. Forget the rat race. You don't have to work your fingers to the bone to build the kind of wealth that creates family dynasties. You have to be in the right place at the right time. And now you are. Listen, it doesn't take skill or training to become wealthy when the currency turns upside down. All you have to do is trade your dollars now while they're still worth something for tangible assets like gold and silver. And when hyperinflation hits, you will automatically be wealthy beyond your wildest imagination. Indulge yourself. Always wanted a big house on the lake? Want to travel the world? Stick your toes in the sands of Costa Rica? Hey, only you know what your deepest desires are. What I'm telling you is that there is one time this century when you'll be able to transfer that kind of wealth to your accounts, and that time is coming soon. Every dollar you have converted to gold could be $100,000 or $1 million or more, depending on how this wealth transfer plays out. It's not about hard work. All it takes is taking steps now before hyperinflation hits. All you need to know are the ins and outs of what to buy, how to do it, and how to leverage your income today. And that's just part of what the Success Council is designed to teach you. Remember, wealth is never destroyed. It only changes hands. Now that you know what's coming, the wealth can flow to you. I'll get into the details a little later. Right now, let's go back to how the greatest wealth transfer in history of the world is going to occur. It's already begun. You actually are living through it.
When the ultimate day of reckoning comes, the ultimate losers will undoubtedly be the average person who does not have gold or silver. The losers will be those who have trusted the national currencies as a place to put their savings, because they'll be wiped out. The paper currencies will be known to be worthless. And this happened many times before. In fact, it happens almost every year. Somewhere in the world, some national currency goes belly up. We don't hear about it because it's usually some small country. But more and more people around the world have learned the lesson that national currencies are not reliable. And the people who are the losers are the ones that learn that lesson last.
The only question is, are you going to wait until the end and get wiped out? Or are you going to take action immediately to preserve and skyrocket your savings and wealth? You see, when Zimbabwe or Argentina or Germany go through hyperinflation, that doesn't really affect the world price of gold. It is more that the value of the gold in those places holds while the price of everything else plummets, so gold can buy so much more. The reason why this will be the greatest wealth transfer in history is because America is the biggest economy the world has ever known, and the entire world runs on U.S. dollars. This time, the economic collapse is not going to affect just a single country. This time, it is a global wealth transfer of historic proportions that will affect every single economy in the world, because almost all currencies in the world are fiat, worthless paper backed by nothing. You will have exactly one shot at this. There will be no do-overs, and the forces at work are merciless and impersonal. You are either on the right side or the wrong side of the wealth transfer, period. When 300 million people in the richest nation on earth go into a gold and silver buying frenzy, along with billions of other people around the world, the price of gold and silver will reach heights never seen in history. You can count on this just as you can count on gravity. At the same time as stock markets plummet and real estate markets crash, the value of gold and silver will skyrocket as it returns to its rightful place as the world's reserve currency. If this were a game of musical chairs, what I just said is the sound of the music stopping. It's time you made sure you have a place to sit. Here's why. China, the biggest holder of U.S. dollars in the world, recently announced not only will they stop buying U.S. bonds, but they will sell off 1/3 of their U.S. dollar holdings and purchase 450 tons of gold. India just purchased 200 tons of gold as a way to diversify away from the U.S. dollar. The rest of the world is in a race against time to transfer their wealth away from U.S. dollars and into gold and silver without alarming anyone else so they can buy it while the price is still low. I strongly suggest you follow the example of these central banks because they clearly know something that the masses don't. Fiat currencies around the world are being rejected and people are moving to gold and silver. The euro is about to implode under its own debt obligations, with Greece defaulting. Spain and Italy have much larger debts, and they're not far behind. Already there are riots in Greece, Spain, and England, and the fiat currencies of the world will all collapse in this decade. And with it, the demand for precious metals to be used as money will, I believe, send the price of gold and silver to the moon. Then, gold and silver purchased at the pre-hyperinflationary prices of today will buy up whole corporations, skyscrapers, city blocks, and suburbs once that collapse takes place.
All currencies are in trouble, all fiat currencies. And it's very misleading if you don't understand that fact. It's misleading because you look at the markets and they say, well, the dollar lost value today compared to the euro, or the yen lost value compared to the dollar. And it makes it sound, for example, that if, say, the dollar gained in value today over the euro, people say, oh, good, the dollar is strengthening. Not so. What it means is that the euro is weakening faster than the dollar. They're all weakening. There is no strengthening going on. It's only relative that it makes it look like one of those currencies is doing better today or last week and so forth. All currencies are going down because all nations are spending more than they're taking in revenue. All nations are creating money based on that additional debt, and the purchasing power of all nations' currencies is going down. It's just a question of which ones are going down faster than the others.
This is a global meltdown of fiat currencies, and the world will be scrambling to buy gold. Not just Americans, everyone. Are you starting to see the massive fortune that is to be made?
Let's look at some of the trends that are happening of late that seemingly refute everything we would expect to happen and would suggest that we're in the middle of a great recovery. Trend number 1, new all-time highs in the stock market. Trend number 2, recovering real estate market. Trend number 3, strong dollar. Trend number 4, stabilized or slightly improving unemployment figures. Trend number 5, severe pullbacks in precious metal prices. Now, before we analyze each trend, let's take a moment to confirm that each of these trends is exactly what the ruling cartel need to keep an unsuspecting public ignorant of the fact that we are close to a financial Armageddon. The last thing they want is for you to prepare and profit from what they are creating. Almost daily, the talking heads on TV remind us that the economy is recovering, and they point out that the first 4 trends as proof. Now, similarly, they say that the lowering gold price is proof that the rest of the world still has lots of confidence in fiat currencies, and that is where you should store your wealth. Nothing to see here. Keep moving on. Everything will be fine. Okay, let's start with trends number 1, 2, and 3 all together. As you learned in Module 1, money printing is a form of theft. If a counterfeiter prints up money in his basement and it is believed to be real, then the counterfeiter gets something for nothing. But where did he get it from? The answer is everyone who was holding the pre-existing currency had a little bit of their purchasing power stolen from them. Now, if the counterfeiter changes his shirt, does that change the result? Of course not. It's exactly the same. If he puts on a suit, does that change the result? Of course not. It's exactly the same. If he has a political friend that passes a law saying counterfeiting is legal and shall be called quantitative easing, the result is, of course, the same. Printing money is just a way of stealing without the victim of the theft knowing that they have been stolen from. So let's look at what the Fed has been doing with quantitative easing, also known as QE1, QE2, and 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There'll be lots of them. Now, each time it is implemented, the Fed basically buys one of 3 things: stocks, mortgage-backed securities, or US Treasuries. They have literally printed many trillions of dollars in the last 8 years. In fact, 4 times more than was printed in the previous 100 years. just to kick the can down the road and stop certain sectors of the economy crashing, because that would be the alarm bell for you. Okay, every time you need to be pacified, they will continue to do the same thing. Print some money, buy some things, inflate some prices somewhere, everything looks good, nothing to see here. If they buy stocks, that's a pretty simple one. When they buy stocks, that pushes the price of stocks higher, or at the very least, stops the price of stocks from dropping. So that one's pretty easy. Well, what are mortgage-backed securities? Well, just a few decades ago, mortgage-backed securities didn't exist. Banks lent money to people to buy a home, and those people paid back the loans to the bank over time. The bank was heavily invested in vetting the person's ability to pay back the loan. If lots of their customers did not pay back the loan and the price of houses fell in value, then the bank would lose lots of money. And if it happened to enough people at once, the bank would be bankrupt. The banks knew this and would be quite cautious in their loans. They required the borrower to save up a deposit for a house so that they had some skin in the game. They would only lend to people with stable jobs and good history, etc. Well, recently, all that's out the window. Banks began bundling up the loans and selling them to third-party investors. These bundles of loans are called mortgage-backed securities. Now, the risk of whether the loans were paid back or not is now no longer with the lender, but some other third party. This resulted in one of the primary reasons for the global financial crisis in 2008. Because lenders no longer cared if the loans got paid back, they lowered their standards and made far riskier loans. They even offered 100% loans, so people didn't even need a deposit. Now, the people who were smart enough to control billions of dollars that bought these mortgage-backed securities understood the inherent risk in this situation. Of course they did. So why did they invest in something that made such little sense? Because they knew their friends in government would bail them out and they could pass on those bogus loans to the taxpayer. So when the Fed buys mortgage-backed securities, what that does is it makes money easy for people to get to buy real estate. Anyone is willing to lend you money because they know the government will buy that debt off them immediately. Easy money for purchases of real estate means demand is strong and real estate prices get pushed up. Of course, the banking cartel made billions of dollars in the good times and passed on the losses to the taxpayer when it all went belly up. And finally, when the Fed buys US Treasuries, that keeps interest rates low because the more demand for Treasuries, the lower the interest rate the government has to pay to borrow money. Low interest rate means people can borrow money for lots of things and it pushes up the prices of stocks, houses, and everything else. So let's look at the effects. Of course, the government, media, and bankers all get to point to a rising stock market and rising house prices and a strong dollar and yell, the recovery is working. Go back to sleep. We're fixing everything. Trust us. So what is happening in the rest of the economy? I think this graph sums it up pretty easily. Since 2008, while the parasitic class has increased, the private sector, the productive sector, has been slaughtered. The very sector that is capable of recovering is being stolen from and destroyed by the government-protected banking cartel. This merely accelerates our troubles and brings us closer to the day of reckoning. It actually makes a recovery less likely. So the power structure has lots of tools up their sleeves to keep these distortions going. You should not expect a nice, gentle trend reversal. You should expect more of the same, but understand it's like stretching an elastic band. The tension gets more and more stressful until, boom, it snaps and violently recoils with a reset of the market. It's very important to understand this because if you don't, you may watch these events month after month and start to realize, well, maybe we're in the middle of a recovery. You may begin to think that the clouds are clearing and sunny days are ahead of us. So that is the reason for trends 1, 2, and 3. The Fed is stealing money from the productive sectors and giving it to unproductive sectors, causing even more bubbles. Trend number 4. That is stabilized or improving unemployment figures. In Module 2, we talked about how these numbers are heavily distorted, so I won't repeat that here. But I want to draw your attention to another trend, and that is these alarming statistics. During the 2008 crisis, 21% of jobs lost were low-wage paying jobs, between $7 and $13. And 60% of the jobs were mid-wage jobs, between $13 and $21. However, 58% of the jobs created since the end of the recession have been low-wage jobs, and only 22% have been mid-wage jobs. What we have seen is the slaughter of the middle class. The jobs are being created and that are not even close to the same quality of the jobs that were lost. The manipulated government figures may appear to be recovering slightly, But the truth is the middle class is migrating to the poor class in droves. So don't believe trend number 4. And finally, trend number 5. Gold and silver prices have not been rising for the last 2 years, as we would expect. In fact, they've dropped. Well, it's a well-known fact that the gold and silver prices are manipulated by the very banks that benefit from the fiat monetary system. The big banks make hundreds of billions of dollars rigging those prices. But even more importantly, they make trillions of dollars keeping this crazy financial system alive with all of their special privileges in place. Then they pay off the regulators to protect them from prosecution. Here is an example from the Financial Times of London. UBS to settle over allegations of precious metals trading. Right there, I'm annoyed at this headline. Why would you settle over allegations of trading precious metals? Trading precious metals is perfectly legal. You know, in a media where they sensationalize everything, why not say exactly what it is? UBS to settle over allegations of precious metals rigging. So look down here in the second paragraph. The Swiss lender is one of a group of banks, including Barclays, Citigroup, HSBC, JP Morgan Chase, and RBS, that are set to announce an agreement of at least £1.5 billion to settle forex rigging allegations. Now, in the second paragraph, they call it rigging allegations at least. Now, the regulators look like they're doing something because of the fines of £1 billion and more. But it sounds like they're doing something good. But no one goes to jail. And the earnings from the riggings are in the hundreds of billions. So the banks just consider this a small cost of doing business. No one got punished. This whole article is just a story about how the criminals divvy up the loot. Look, if you or I were to steal a car worth $10,000, we would go to jail. But if you're a bank and steal hundreds of billions of pounds, you just pay a 1% commission to the regulators and they will protect you. No jail time. You might have to pay a little bit extra, a few extra $100 million in bribes as well. That's it. It is just the criminals divvying up the loot. That's all that story is. So, why do the banks manipulate the price of precious metals? Because metals are the canary in the gold mine that signal to the rest of the world that trouble is brewing. Traditionally, when currencies look risky, investors turn to gold as a safe haven. Now, that is happening, by the way, I can assure you. But you don't know that because the price of gold is not being bid up. It's not visible because they absorb all of that demand by selling paper promises for gold. So, how do the big banks rig the prices? There are a number of ways, but the one way I want you to understand today is that they sell metals that they don't have. They just sell pieces of paper that are promises for gold, even though they don't have any gold to sell. This soaks up all of that demand without the price being bid up. In fact, it is provable that there is so many paper promises for gold out there that these promises account for 100 times more gold than there is all the gold in storage in bullion facilities all over the world. Now, these promises cannot be delivered on, obviously. Now, this scam has worked for quite a while, but we are approaching the day when demand for delivery of the metal will be too great, and then the people who bought the paper promises will realize they were duped. When that happens, the paper price of gold and the physical price of gold will split. 99% of gold investors will be holding a worthless piece of paper with a promise for gold by a bankrupt bank or a brokerage house on it. And the 1% with actual physical gold in their possession will see its value go up 10, 20, or 30 times in value. Think about how that could change your life. How would your day be different if your net wealth went up 10 times in 1 year? Would you retire earlier than planned? Would you pay off your mortgage? Would you even need to go to work the next day? How would your wife or husband and children look at you differently? That is the great wealth transfer that is going to take place. If you hold paper currency or paper promises for anything, then the wealth will flow from you to them, just like it has been for decades. But now that you know what they are doing to you and have planned for you, you can reverse it. So you can convert at least a portion of your wealth today away from those paper assets and into real physical wealth like gold and silver. So when will they stop the manipulation? The answer is they won't. Now let me be clear on this. They will never stop the manipulation, ever. And that means the price of gold and silver will never go up again, ever, until we stop the manipulation. That sounds like something hard, like something we've got to do. It's really not. In fact, it's going to happen very, very soon. Here is how this is going to go down. The economy is so broken right now that it is barely functioning. Almost every country in the world has to print money and to go into massive amounts of debt just to stop their economies collapsing. Company by company, city by city, state by state, and country by country, you will see more and more, bigger and bigger financial crises all over the world. With each new crisis, more and more people will wake up and seek the refuge and safety of physical precious metals. So each day the availability of actual physical precious metals goes down. Eventually, they simply will not be able to deliver any metal to people who are demanding it, and then the game is over for them. That is when the music stops, and that is why it's so important for you to get a chair now. You don't want to be the one left standing when the music stops. Usually, rising precious metal prices are the signal that all of this is happening. But since 2011, they have controlled the price of metal, and that signal is gone. Now, just like many times in history, all of the elements are there for a great wealth transfer. The key to not being fooled is to be aware of these 5 fake trends. It's easy to say the stock market is high, real estate market is high, employment, inflation looks good, and the canary is not singing because metal prices are not going up. Do not think that things are hunky-dory. They are not. The government has to print trillions of dollars and go into trillions of dollars of debt just to make those sectors appear to be doing well. It's all designed to lull you to sleep while the great wealth transfer happens.